the Department of Anti-Delusional. Like, you could pack this whole room full of kill agents. I'm training them. Like, I'll eat them if I decide I want to turn on them.
Diluvian research studies. Their research, of course, goes back much further than this flood, back to the beginning of the world itself, including the flying city of Autopapadopolis. The Autopapadopolis that the Foundation knows is just a broken fragment of the first city, where a proto-human known as Assem ruled, and mankind got its start. The question remains of what happened before the founding of Autopapadopolis, and Malthus admits that they just don't know. Whatever existed before humanity didn't leave a written record, but other beings did exist back then. Malthus then turns the discussion towards gods, which are very real and are powerful. There are, of course, a number of entities of great power that would be considered god-like by most people, but they're referring to more fundamental entities. They know of a couple gods that resided in Autopapadopolis, thanks to information gleaned from Seth. One was Mechane, the broken god, and another was Yaldabaoth, the god of flesh. The fairies, who predated humanity by millions of years, also had a number of gods they worshipped, the principal one among them being Ea, or Titania. According to ancient legends, Ea walked over the canopies of the fairies' forests, granting their wishes and singing to them. Most depictions of Ea are of an entity much like a fairy, while others depict her as a star, or as a beam of moonlight, or even as a sort of mother tree. As a side note, we now know who the entity made of stars is, as depicted in one of the murals in Autopapadopolis. Malthus and his team believes that the dead tree hanging in the cavern is, or at least was, Titania, and samples taken from the heart in the prison share undeniable similarities with the tree. The only way they'd really know for sure is to bring one of the fairies from SCP-4000 to confirm it, but they're reasonably sure regardless. That means that Titania is dead, but they're not sure what caused her death, as the removal of her heart seems to have been performed after the tree was already dead.
They're out there.
Malthus has some speculation as to why there are new growths if the tree is dead, but leaves it by saying that since the tree is the corpse of a god, they can't apply normal logic to what it's capable of. The meeting goes on to discussing the entity currently stuck in the tree, Hector. According to the old texts, each of the 4 knights had been afflicted by a different curse placed on them by the fairy princess. Lust for Lahire, wrath for Lancelot, despair for Ogier, and agony for Hector. Project Paragon was founded in order to mitigate the effects of these 4 knights, who are re-emerging into the world, as well as the 3 profanities themselves, described in SCP-4812. The Foundation believes that the entity that the Global Occult Coalition uncovered is the same Fey princess that was responsible for corrupting the Knights and the 3 great profanities, and there's a lot of trouble brewing now thanks to that. Malthus believes that the forest in the cavern contains ancient ruins that could be a potential treasure trove of information preserved by anomalous means that could be invaluable in Project Paragon's efforts. He proposes a manned expedition into the forest, led by Applied Task Force Het-1, Lance of Longinus. This obviously isn't an easy task, starting with the fact that the 35-kilometer trip down to the base of the cavern floor will take the team just over 6 hours. The return trip will take them just over 24 hours, however, due to needing to depressurize. The fog, of course, is the real issue, as even though their suits can filter it out, if any of it sticks onto their suits when they return, it could easily be deadly. They're going to combat the fog in two ways. One of them, of course, being the judicial application of flamethrowers as they go through the forest. The other, though, is a plan involving putting a temporary foam seal over the open gash in the side of the tree where the fog is pouring out, applied via drones. They plan on spraying a high-density polyethylene foam across the gash, waiting 20 hours for the remaining fog to settle, and then proceeding through the forest. They don't believe that the seal will do any lasting harm to 6666, and it will break down itself after 5 weeks. They don't really expect Hector to give them much trouble while spraying, but they have sedatives and cable binders planned if he tries to interfere. What could possibly go wrong? Before we get to that, though, we're given a staff psychology report for the personnel stationed around the tree. The psychology complaints began with more mundane things, such as fear of heights or unhappiness about an extended work assignment. But before long, some more curious things began. Personnel began reporting feelings of being watched while in the cavern, feelings of despair, and more commonly, vivid, unsettling dreams. Noticeably, many of these dreams involved a monster with 6 eyes, killing and or consuming the personnel or their loved ones. One of them specifically reported on a dream in which they are trapped in a hole while a monster with 6 eyes devours their mother.
It's the way you play the Ouija board.
These nightmares are, of course, not coincidental, as we'll later see. Operation Cauterize then commences, in which 3 large drones are equipped with massive canisters of high-density spray foam and sent out towards the tree. They begin spraying the opening in the side of the tree with the foam, and before long, Hector begins following the drones with his eyes. As the foam starts to set, Hector attempts to pull it away from his body, forcing the drones to fire some tranquilizer darts into Hector's chest. In return, Hector destroys one of the drones with his spear, and the other 2 retreat to a safe distance as Hector continues to try to remove the foam. Cable binders are then fired from a nearby Foundation tower, pinning Hector to the tree. It takes multiple cables to keep him down, but eventually the drones are allowed to continue spraying the foam while Hector vocalizes loudly. Once the drones are finished and the foam sets, no more fog can be seen leaking out of the tree.
Ammonium acid being the danger noodles venom.
Earlier, Kane mentioned an ancient sorcerer known as Methuselah, whom the Foundation apparently had contained.
Over there.
As it turns out, Methuselah is none other than SCP-343, with the rather grandiose nickname of God. Dr. Clef was sent in to interview Methuselah about the situation, due to his natural resistance against anomalous alteration. Clef says that he knows Methuselah's age now, which is not as ageless as the universe as 343 claims, and that he's really Methuselah the Arcanist, the royal vizier of the House of Maladrog.
Keep it down.
This revelation shocks 343, and Clef says that Kane told them the info, and that if he'd known Methuselah was here, he would have warned the Foundation long ago. 343 admits that the info is true, even though he hasn't gone by that name in a long, long time. He's annoyed that Kane even knew who he was, as he worked very hard to try and keep his distance from Kane and his family. Methuselah agrees to provide some information, but he says that even his great mind is not infallible, and he doesn't have a photographic memory like Kane does. He says that he was born a long, long time ago, in a place that has not existed since the seas rose, and the world was a more magical place back then. His name was Matthew. His mother's name was Mira, but he doesn't remember his father's name, a royal official for the king in the Valley Ulem. He says that the Sky Kings styled themselves the mightiest and most ancient kingdom of men, and people would tell stories about how King Apollyon had stolen some great treasure from the court of the gods, and it gave him dominion over the kingdoms. It's clear that Methuselah is not as rich a source of information on the era as Cain or Seth.
If you open up that door.
He goes on to say that there was some sort of military campaign where Apollyon called young men to serve in his armies, and all of the great houses would have to answer. And then the king died, followed by his son. He also recalls the parable about the 4 knights, 3 of which betrayed the king, and 1 that went to his doom trying to please him, Hector.
Chandler Wildlife out there.
Methuselah says that he doesn't really know what happened to the Sky King, but one day messages from them stopped coming, and the next day there was smoke over the mountains of Apollyon.
She's a wild danger noodle, man.
Later, they'd hear bits and pieces from travelers talking about a monster with many faces and a creature that killed any who looked at it, speaking of 2 of the 3 great profanities. Methuselah does recall a memory of when he was a boy, seeing a demon the size of a mountain with 6 eyes, crashing and screaming and dragging its way to the north, away from the sea. But he doesn't know any more.
Come with the book, then
Clef changes the topic to the children of the night, which causes Methuselah to once again be shocked, and he says that he's forgotten a lot of things in his life, but he'll never forget them. He was a young wizard at the time, no more than 60 or 70, and he had left Ulem after his mother passed to go into the desert and study with a Daevite sorcerer. He knew about the fairies at the time, as people told stories, but most people had never seen one, since they lived across the sea.
It's you, buddy.
It was said that if you went across the sea, you'd find a white city where you could trade with fairies on starry nights.
It's like stonemason.
The stories also spoke of the children of the night, who lived with the fairies in the woods, and they were said to be monsters, used as bedtime stories to scare children at night.
You did. You're still doing it.
Methuselah remembers the first time he laid eyes on them, from the distance on a summer night. They were massive things, taller than any man and covered in matted hair. He says that they were like someone described a man to you, but they had never seen a man themselves. Their eyes glowed in the dark, and they just stood there in a row. Methuselah and the others with him tried to approach and communicate, but they just stared and made a horrible noise, like a child giggling, or sang eerie songs in high-pitched voices. Methuselah's master, the High Magistrate, who he says was an extremely powerful figure, went out to them to disperse them. Instead, his magic didn't seem to affect them at all, and they simply laughed and pulled apart his body. Methuselah and the others tried to flee, but they were faster and stronger than any man, not bothered by magic or weapons, although they did seem to dislike fire. The children of the night rounded them all up and bound them in black chains, dragging them back to their ships along the ground. Methuselah only survived by laying on top of an old farmer, who ended up being grinded against the earth and killed. There ended up being so many captives on the children's ships that there wasn't even room to lay down, but after a week or so, enough had died that the others could sit on top of them. They didn't seem to know what to feed their captives, giving them raw meat and seawater, which Methuselah was at least able to make potable. After a month, they arrived across the sea and were taken into the dark forest. All Methuselah remembers is how dark it was, and how you could always feel their hair brushing up against you, like they were right on top of you, watching. They hung up their chains in the trees, and would come by and pull a person off of their manacles, like picking an apple, and then they would just play with them, violently. They'd poke a man so hard their fingers would go straight through, or squeeze until their eyes would pop out. He recalls seeing a pregnant woman get pulled in half, as if they were opening a bag of chips, with the children of the night only giggling as they did so, while playing in the blood. He goes on to say that the children never slept, ever. And you could try to sleep, but they'd watch you the entire time. If you did manage to fall asleep, it was worse, because they could somehow enter your dreams, and there they had no limitations. After a while, Methuselah and other survivors decided that that's how they communicated to one another, in nightmares. The captives needed to be there in order to dream, so that the children could communicate with each other. Their whole history was also etched into those dreams, and Methuselah had a repeating dream of seeing a fairy surrounded by other smaller fairies, with an infinite line of children of the night in the background watching her. He says that the children always felt so miserable and sad, and they never felt like there was any hatred on their part, just that they didn't think the same way as others. Clef asks him how he escaped, but Methuselah says that no one ever escaped unless you were dead, at which point they'd take your body to their god and throw you in a pit. He says that when you went into the pit, you became part of the nightmare, and sometimes they would see twisted mockeries of their friends' faces when they dreamt.
Look.
There were fairies captured with him, but he says they were broken in some way that he can't describe.
Arguing with your territory.
A number of the captured humans spent their time making plans and schemes on how to escape, but the fairies there were just broken. He supposes that he did escape, though, thanks to another old sorcerer named Noah. He always said that he had a plan to get them out of there, and then one day he disappeared. They thought that he had been taken off somewhere else, but